My dream home turned into a nightmare on a beautiful spring morning. Driving to my newly purchased property to survey the landscape, I discovered an old train strategically placed right across my only access point. Not kidding, an actual train with several rusty cargo cars blocking the only entrance to my land. The HOA president, who had orchestrated it all, just smiled as she explained their sudden railway heritage preservation project. I had invested my entire savings into this piece of land. Have you ever found yourself in a seemingly impossible situation? Share in the comments where you're watching from, because this story of how I turned this disaster into victory will show you the power of knowledge and perseverance. You see, I'm Ethan Miller, a 35-year-old architect with a passion for designing unique spaces. After a difficult divorce, I had finally found the perfect 2-acre plot just outside Sunridge Valley. The price was surprisingly reasonable, mainly because it sat just outside the HOA's official boundaries, but required an easement through their land for access. The previous owner had explicitly included illegal right-of-ways in our contract, which I had carefully reviewed before signing. My father, a retired real estate attorney, had always emphasized the importance of reading every line of any contract, advice that would soon prove invaluable. "Always check the fine print, son," he would say, "because that's where they hide the daggers." Those words echoed in my head as I stood facing this unexpected iron barricade. The morning I discovered the train, I immediately called the HOA office and was told that Veronica Whitmore, the president, would meet me on site. 20 minutes later, a glossy white SUV pulled up, and out stepped a woman in her late 30s wearing designer clothes that somehow managed to look both expensive and ill-fitting. Her bleach blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and oversized sunglasses covered half her face. "Mr. Miller," she said with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, "welcome to Sunridge Valley. I see you've noticed our exciting new preservation project." Her voice had that artificial sweetness that reminded me of saccharin, claiming to be sugar while being anything but. "This railway is an important cultural heritage site," she continued, gesturing toward the rusting metal monstrosity. "Our community recently voted to restore this historic landmark. I'm afraid it means your access point is now unavailable." I took a deep breath, fighting to maintain my composure. "Ms. Whitmore, I have a legal easement that guarantees my right to access my property through this road," I explained, pulling out the contract from my folder. "This document was signed and notarized by the previous owner, and clearly states my right-of-ways cannot be obstructed." "Well, that agreement predates our new preservation bylaws," she replied with a dismissive wave. "The HOA board recently passed emergency regulations prioritizing cultural heritage projects over individual access rights. We sent notices to all affected parties." I frowned. "I never received any notice, and I closed on this property just 2 weeks ago." Her smile tightened. "Perhaps it was lost in the mail. Regardless, the bylaws are quite clear. The preservation project takes precedence. But," she added, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "we might be able to work something out if you're interested in joining our HOA. We could potentially create an alternate access point for a reasonable fee." Standing there in the bright sunshine, looking at the train that somehow appeared far too clean and well-placed for an abandoned relic, I realized this was no coincidence. The timing was too perfect. The train had apparently been placed just days before I was set to begin my architectural surveys. Later that afternoon, I spoke with a local contractor who had been working in the area. "That train?" he said with a confused expression. "It wasn't there last week. They brought it in on flatbeds, 3 of them, and assembled it right on those tracks. Strangest thing I've ever seen." That confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't about historical preservation. It was a deliberate attempt to force me into their HOA or abandon my property. What they didn't know was that before becoming an architect, I had worked as a legal clerk to help pay for college, specializing in property law, and I wasn't about to let them derail my dreams with a fake heritage scam. The more I investigated, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just an isolated incident of bureaucratic overreach. It was a calculated scheme. I contacted the local historical society, and they confirmed they had no record of any significant railway heritage in that specific area. There was a small spur line decades ago, the historian told me, but it held no particular historical importance, and all tracks were removed in the 70s during urban development. This was further evidence that Veronica's preservation project was nothing but fiction designed to manipulate and control. What frustrated me most wasn't just the blockage of my property access, but the sheer audacity of their deception, creating an elaborate historical fraud and expecting everyone to simply accept it without question. Standing under the harsh sun, staring at the rusty train blocking the path to my dream, I realized I was facing not just a bored housewife seeking power, but an organized conspiracy. They wanted to turn my land into part of their fake preservation site to receive government funding, or force me to join their HOA. But what they didn't know was, I still had an ace up my sleeve that nobody had seen coming. The following morning, I drove to the Sunridge Valley HOA office, a small converted ranch house with a freshly painted exterior that didn't quite match its shabby interior. The walls were covered with framed posters of heritage preservation and cultural legacy projects, all looking suspiciously recent and staged. Behind a desk sat a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Melissa Chen, the HOA secretary. She seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned my situation, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with papers on her desk. "Ms. Whitmore is expecting you," she said quietly, leading me to a conference room where Veronica sat with a balding man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit whom she introduced as Douglas Pierce, the HOA's attorney. "Mr. Miller," Veronica began, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "I understand you're upset about our Sunridge Railway Heritage Project, but I assure you this preservation initiative is vital to our community's cultural identity. The board unanimously approved this project months ago." I placed my easement documents on the table. My right of access is legally binding and was registered with the county. You can't simply place a train on active easement property without proper notification or approval. Douglas cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Miller, our bylaws specifically allow for emergency preservation measures to protect historically significant structures. Section 7.3 of our recently updated regulations clearly states that community cultural preservation initiatives take precedence over individual access rights." He slid a document across the table, a copy of the bylaws with highlighted text. "These changes were properly voted on and implemented last month." I skimmed the document, immediately noticing the convenient timing. "May I ask who verified these historical claims?" Typically, historical designations require extensive documentation and approval from state historical societies. Veronica's smile faltered slightly. "We have an independent cultural preservation committee that handles all the necessary verification. Rest assured, everything is entirely above board." What caught my attention, however, was Melissa's reaction. She was standing near the door, and at the mention of the committee, her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly looked away. Something was definitely off. As I left the office under the blazing noon sun, a white-hailed man in his late 60s intercepted me in the parking lot. "Meet me at Valley View Coffee at 2 o'clock, he said quietly, checking over his shoulder. "I'm Frank Thompson. I know what's really going on." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me intrigued. My next stop was the city planning department, where I hoped to find information about any legitimate historical railway in the area. The clerk shook her head when I inquired. "HOAs operate independently, and the city doesn't typically intervene in their local preservation initiatives," she explained, making air quotes around the last 3 words. "Between you and me," she added, lowering her voice, "we've been getting a lot of these heritage projects popping up lately. Convenient way to control development without going through proper channels." Back in my car, I found an email from Veronica on my phone, offering to collaborate by including my land in their larger preservation project in exchange for a small compensation package. The message ended with a thinly veiled threat. It would be a shame if access issues prevented you from enjoying your property investment. The following morning, I drove past my property to find new signs posted around its perimeter. "Heritage Conservation Area. No trespassing." My blood boiled as I realized they were escalating their tactics. The signs had official-looking Sunridge Valley HOA seals and warnings about penalties for disturbing a protected cultural site. I was being systematically boxed out of my own property. At 2 o'clock sharp, I walked into Valley View Coffee, a small independent cafe well outside the Sunridge Valley area. Frank was already there, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee. "Been working on the railways for 43 years before retiring," he said by way of introduction. "What they're telling you is complete bullshit." He pulled out a folder containing old photographs and maps of the area. There was a railway line there, sure, but it was decommissioned and removed in 1975. The city took ownership of the land after the railway company went bankrupt. More importantly, that HOA wasn't even formed until 1992, 17 years after the tracks were gone. They have zero historical claim to it. Frank leaned forward, his weathered face serious. But here's the real story. Veronica isn't interested in history. She's creating a fake heritage park on HOA land and adjacent properties, including yours, to secure a massive grant from a private preservation foundation. She's promised to launder part of that grant money through ghost consulting companies. This isn't her first rodeo either. Before moving here, she was fired from a local museum for embezzlement, but her wealthy husband's connections kept it quiet. I felt my stomach knot as the pieces fell into place. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Frank's expression hardened. "Because she's destroyed this community." It started with petty rules about lawn height and house colors, escalated to massive fines for minor infractions, and now she's effectively running a money laundering operation through fake preservation projects. Several of us have tried to stand up to her, but she's got too many board members in her pocket. You're the first person with legal grounds to challenge her directly. As I drove back to my office under the afternoon sun, I vacillated between anger and helplessness. This was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce, not a legal battle against a corrupt HOA. That evening, I pored over internet resources and old legal textbooks my father had given me, searching for any precedent that might help. As I flipped through my father's old notebook in my architecture office under the fading afternoon light, a photograph fell out, a picture of this area from 1987, before the HOA was established. And in that photo, there were no railway tracks at all. No railway heritage, no historical significance, just an elaborate scam. But how could I prove it? Early the next morning, I headed to the local library as soon as it opened, determined to find historical records of the area. The librarian, a helpful woman named Eleanor, directed me to their local history archives. "We've digitized most of the county maps and property records," she explained, setting me up at a computer terminal. "You should be able to find anything dating back to the 1900s. For the next 3 hours, I combed through historical maps, newspaper clippings, and county records. Eleanor occasionally brought me additional materials she thought might help. The evidence confirmed Frank's story. A railway line had indeed existed in the area, but was officially decommissioned and removed in 1975. More importantly, I found the official city resolution transferring ownership of the former railway property to the city itself, not to any homeowners association. "This is interesting," Eleanor said, pointing to a record from 1992. "The Sunridge Valley development was only established that year, and the HOA was formed simultaneously. There's no way they could have any historical claim to railway property that had been city-owned for 17 years before they even existed." Armed with this knowledge, I visited the transportation department during lunch hour, meeting an elderly employee named Walter Johnson at a nearby park. He'd worked for the department since the 1980s and remembered the area well. "Those tracks were removed long before any houses were built there," he confirmed, unwrapping his sandwich. "What's more, no one could legally reinstall railway tracks without special permits from both the city and state transportation authorities. I've checked our records. No such permits have been issued in that area for over 40 years. Walter's information confirmed my growing suspicion that everything about this preservation project was fraudulent. My next move was risky but necessary. I returned to my property in the early afternoon, parking at a public lot over half a mile away and hiking in through a back trail to avoid the security guards Veronica had stationed near the main entrance. Hidden behind trees, I took detailed photographs of the historic train. Up close, the deception was even more obvious. The train cars had been painted to look weathered, but underneath were modern materials. I even found a small plaque partially hidden on one car that identified it as a movie prop used in a film shot in the area 3 years prior. The next day, things escalated dramatically. A certified letter arrived from the HOA's lawyer threatening legal action for trespassing on a protected heritage site and demanding I cease any attempts to access my property through the historically significant railway area. Simultaneously, security patrols around my property increased, with guards taking photos of me whenever I approached. Most alarming was a notice posted on the declaring that any property adjacent to preservation areas must comply with special building restrictions and could be subject to heritage expansion requirements. They were trying to either force me out or bring my land under their control through these fabricated preservation claims. I tried approaching city officials again, but they continued to maintain that HOA disputes were outside their jurisdiction unless there was clear evidence of criminal activity. Without proof of fraud that rises to a criminal level, this remains a civil matter between you and the HOA, a city attorney explained apologetically. Under the scorching midday sun at an outdoor restaurant far from Sunridge Valley, I had a chance encounter with Melissa Chen. She sat down at my table, nervously checking over her shoulder. "I shouldn't be talking to you," she began, fidgeting with her napkin. "But what Veronica is doing isn't just unfair, it's illegal." Melissa revealed that Veronica wasn't only scamming the Preservation Foundation, but was using the fake projects to launder money for a suspicious organization. She keeps all the real financial documents on a separate computer. The board only sees what she wants us to see. Reaching into her purse, Melissa handed me a USB drive. I copied these when she left her office unlocked last week. These are the internal documents for the Sunridge Heritage Project. Your property is marked as acquisition target and to be included in grant proposal. Even though they have no legal right to it, the documents were damning, showing detailed plans to create a fabricated historical narrative for the area to secure funding, with my land prominently featured despite not being under HOA control. Later that afternoon, I received another email from Veronica. This one more threatening than the last. "Security footage shows you trespassing on protected HOA property yesterday," she wrote. "We're prepared to file charges unless you agree to meet and discuss a mutual resolution to our situation." She was escalating her pressure tactics, clearly worried about what I might have discovered. That evening, I felt completely cornered. Sitting at my desk in my architecture office, staring blankly out the window, I considered abandoning my dream property altogether. The legal battle could drag on for years, draining my finances and energy. In a moment of weakness, I called my father for advice. Though retired, his legal mind remained as sharp as ever. The conversation changed everything. "Remember, Ethan," he said, "every HOA operates based on legal documents, bylaws, covenants, articles of incorporation. If Veronica's falsifying heritage claims, she's likely playing fast and loose with other regulations too. Start with the original documents and look for inconsistencies. Follow the paper trail." The phone call ended, my hands still trembling, but no longer from despair. "Sometimes," my father said, "to win a battle, you don't need to fight. Just find the chink in your opponent's armor." And I had just remembered something important. Every HOA is built on legal documents, bylaws. I needed to find the original copies and all amendments that had been made. As the late afternoon sunlight streamed through my office window, illuminating the path ahead, I knew it was time to switch from defense to offense. Early the next morning, I arrived at the county registrar's office right as it opened, requesting official copies of Sunridge Valley HOA's original bylaws and all subsequent amendments. The clerk, a woman with graying hair and a sympathetic smile, raised an eyebrow at my request. "That's quite a lot of documentation," she said. "Is this for legal purposes?" I nodded, explaining that I was researching potential irregularities. Something in my expression must have resonated with her, because she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "I've seen a lot of HOA disputes in my 20 years here, Mr. Miller. Some of these associations forget they exist to serve communities, not rule them like tiny kingdoms. I'll expedite this for you." 2 hours later, I was sitting at a nearby coffee shop with a substantial stack of documents, methodically working through decades of HOA paperwork, making notes and highlighting inconsistencies. The original bylaws, dated 1992, contained a crucial provision. Any bylaw amendments required a 75% member vote and signatures from at least 3 board members to be valid. Yet the recent emergency preservation amendments had bypassed this requirement entirely. As I continued examining the documents, something else caught my attention. The signatures on recent amendments looked suspiciously similar across multiple documents, despite supposedly coming from different board members. Taking several pages to a handwriting expert I'd contacted earlier, I sat in his office as he examined the signatures under magnification. "These are definitely problematic," he concluded, pointing to specific characteristics. "See these patterns in the formation of letters? 2 of these supposed different signatures were almost certainly made by the same person. In my professional opinion, at least 2 of these board member signatures have been forged. This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed, not just ethically questionable behavior, but potentially criminal forgery." Over the next few days, I approached several HOA board members, carefully timing my visits to catch them at their workplaces or homes during afternoon hours, away from Veronica's watchful eye. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Many board members had no knowledge of the recent preservation amendments or had been told they were simply routine administrative updates that didn't require full board review. One particularly revealing conversation came from an elderly board member named Grace Peterson, who invited me into her garden when I approached her. "I've been on this board for 12 years, she explained, examining the documents I showed her, "and I certainly never signed this. The first I heard about any railway preservation was when they started bringing in those train cars a few weeks ago. Veronica claimed it was all properly approved, but board meetings have become more perfunctory lately. She presents everything is already decided, just needing our rubber stamp." Grace's testimony, along with similar statements from other board members, provided clear evidence that proper procedures hadn't been followed. Meanwhile, Veronica had discovered I was approaching board members and called an emergency meeting, painting me as an outsider, harassing board members, and threatening the community's cultural heritage project. The HOA sent a cease and desist letter, threatening litigation if I continued interfering with HOA operations and seeking a restraining order to prevent me from entering the neighborhood altogether. Some board members, either intimidated by Veronica or complicit in her schemes, publicly supported her narrative. A small faction even began a whisper campaign suggesting I was trying to acquire the land for commercial development that would destroy neighborhood property values. The battle lines were being drawn, with community members forced to choose sides. During this tense period, I made two critical discoveries while reviewing historical documents. First, I found that all HOAs in our state were required to register as nonprofit organizations and file annual financial statements with the state auditor's office, something Sunridge Valley had failed to do for the past 3 years. Second, and even more damning, all heritage preservation projects required registration with the state's Historical Preservation Office, and the Sunridge Railway Heritage Project didn't appear in any official records. These weren't just procedural oversights. They represented serious legal violations that could potentially invalidate the HOA's authority entirely. My next step was to quietly build a coalition of dissatisfied residents. Frank introduced me to several neighbors who had suffered under Veronica's increasingly restrictive rules. We began meeting in small groups at the city park on weekend mornings, sitting on different benches and appearing to be strangers, enjoying the nice weather while actually exchanging information and coordinating our efforts. Melissa proved invaluable, providing internal documents showing how HOA fees had been misappropriated for years. I worked tirelessly, using my design skills to create clear visual presentations of the evidence, compiling a comprehensive dossier of the HOA's violations. My eyes were red from exhaustion, but there was a determined fire in them that hadn't been there before. Our informal alliance, which we called the Sunridge Transparency Committee, grew to include 15 residents, each assigned specific tasks: gathering signatures, collecting testimonials, and searching for additional evidence of misconduct. We identified 9 violations of state regulations, 5 instances of document forgery, and a mysterious preservation consulting fee of $45,000 transferred to a shell company registered at Veronica's sister's address. While organizing these documents, under the fading afternoon light, I discovered my phone had been infected with spyware from an IP address matching the HOA office's Wi-Fi network. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about justice, and I was ready for the next move. The real breakthrough came when our group's research uncovered a critical legal vulnerability. According to county records, Sunridge Valley HOA had never completed the mandatory registration process to become an official nonprofit organization, a requirement under state law since 2001. This meant that every rule, fee, and penalty the HOA had imposed for over 20 years potentially lacked legal standing. With this information, we had the leverage needed to challenge not just the fake preservation project, but the very existence of the HOA itself. The following weekend, our group met at an outdoor restaurant in the suburbs, appearing to be nothing more than friends enjoying brunch in the spring sunshine. I laid out everything I'd discovered, spreading documents across the table between plates of untouched food. "This goes deeper than we initially thought," I explained, pointing to financial records Melissa had provided. "Veronica hasn't just been manipulating HOA rules. She's been operating a sophisticated fraud scheme. The Railway Heritage Project is completely fabricated to secure grant money from preservation foundations. There's no historical significance, no proper authorization, and most importantly, no legal basis for blocking access to my property." Frank nodded grimly, adding, I've spoken with 3 former board members who confirmed they never approved any railway preservation initiative. Their signatures were added without their knowledge, Melissa, nervous but determined, explained how financial records had been systematically altered to hide questionable expenditures. There's a pattern of diverting HOA funds to consultant fees that always seem to end up in companies connected to Veronica's family members. Our newly formed Sunridge Transparency Committee divided responsibilities. Frank would gather additional historical evidence about the railway's removal, Melissa would continue monitoring internal HOA communications, and several other residents would discreetly collect signed affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed irregularities. I hired an independent real estate attorney, meeting her at an outdoor cafe, who confirmed our legal standing. With the evidence you've gathered, particularly the non-registration issue, you have grounds to petition the court for an emergency injunction against the HOA's actions. More importantly, you could potentially invalidate their authority entirely. Our campaign to quietly inform other residents began, with committee members approaching neighbors during evening walks, community events, or casual encounters at local shops. We were careful to present evidence rather than accusations, letting people draw their own conclusions about the HOA's activities. Many residents, it turned out, had their own grievances against Veronica's management, but had been too intimidated to speak up individually. Within days, Veronica realized something was happening. Suspicious of the increasing number of residents asking pointed questions about HOA finances and the preservation project, she sent threatening letters to suspected supporters, warning of consequences for undermining critical community heritage initiatives. HOA fees were suddenly increased to cover security and preservation development costs, and new restrictions limited residents' ability to modify their properties or host gatherings without approval. Douglas, the HOA lawyer, sent me a formal legal warning accusing me of defamation and conspiracy to disrupt community cultural initiatives, threatening expensive litigation if I continued. Veronica also hired security guards to patrol near my property and the homes of known committee members, ostensibly to protect cultural assets. Rather than intimidating us, these heavy-handed tactics only strengthened our resolve and convinced more residents to join our cause. The oppressive atmosphere in the neighborhood became so obvious that even previously neutral residents began to question the HOA's legitimacy. On a cool morning in late spring, Melissa took an enormous risk. Using her key to the HOA office during lunch hour when everyone was out, she searched Veronica's files and discovered a smoking gun, a signed contract between Veronica and a suspicious private foundation, promising her a personal consulting commission of $250,000 if the Heritage Project was approved, conditional on my property being included in the development. This explicit evidence of conflict of interest and self-dealing was exactly what we needed. She's been playing a double game, Melissa explained, her hands shaking as she showed me the documents, publicly claiming this is for community benefit while privately arranging a massive payday for herself. There's also evidence she's been using the HOA as a personal piggy bank for years. This discovery coincided with information Frank had obtained from the city planning office. The land where the fake historic railway had been placed was actually designated for a future community greenway, a project Veronica had been actively blocking while pursuing her own schemes. With mounting evidence and growing community support, we prepared to take legal action. Our attorney drafted formal complaints to the county court, the state attorney general's office, and the Preservation Foundation, being targeted for fraudulent grants. We were ready to move, but then something unexpected happened. Veronica, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, reached out with a surprising offer. "Mr. Miller," her email began with uncharacteristic formality, "in the interest of community harmony, I'd like to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. We would welcome incorporating your property into our preservation project, with you serving as the official preservation architect for a generous annual stipend. All access issues would be resolved immediately. The offer included an attached non-disclosure agreement covering all HOA activity. It was clearly a desperate attempt to buy my silence and complicity. The financial offer was substantial, enough to purchase a different, potentially better property elsewhere without any of these complications. For a brief moment, I was tempted. That afternoon, I walked through the city park under golden sunlight, wrestling with the decision. The easy path would be to take Veronica's money and walk away. I could find another property, avoid years of potential legal battles, and resume my life. But as I watched families enjoying the park, I thought about the 57 households in Sunridge Valley who had suffered under Veronica's tyranny for years. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about holding the powerful accountable and restoring a community. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Integrity isn't doing the right thing when it's easy. It's doing the right thing when it's hard. As the sun began setting behind the buildings, I had my answer. I texted Veronica. I accept your proposal. Let's meet at the notary's office Friday, 10 a.m. She didn't know I had prepared a surprise. I had discovered something no one had realized for 30 years about the very existence of the Sunridge Valley HOA. I revealed my critical discovery to our committee at an early morning meeting at a local bakery. According to county records, I explained, spreading documents across the table, Sunridge Valley HOA never completed the mandatory registration process to become an official nonprofit organization, a requirement under state law since 2001. Every rule they've enforced, every fee they've collected for over 20 years has been without proper legal authority. The implications were staggering. Not only could we challenge the fake preservation project, but we could potentially invalidate the entire HOA and demand refunds of all fees collected since 2001. Our attorney, impressed with the thoroughness of our research, drafted a formal complaint to the county court, seeking an emergency injunction against the HOA and a petition for dissolution based on their failure to maintain proper legal standing. This is one of the strongest cases against an HOA I've seen in 20 years of practice, she told us. The combination of procedural violations, financial improprieties, and fraudulent activities creates a perfect storm. Simultaneously, we submitted our evidence of financial fraud and the fake preservation scheme to the county prosecutor's office, which agreed to open a preliminary investigation. Frank contributed another crucial piece of evidence, official city documentation proving the railway had been formally removed in 1975, with the property transferred to municipal ownership. There was absolutely no legal basis for the HOA to place train cars on that land or claim any historical significance. They've been operating on bluffs and intimidation for years, Frank explained. Nobody ever challenged them directly because they created an atmosphere of fear. Our final preparation involved discreetly contacting the legitimate preservation foundation that Veronica had been targeting with her fraudulent grant proposal. When presented with evidence of the scam, their director was appalled and immediately agreed to cooperate with authorities. We take heritage preservation seriously, she told us. Using fake historical claims to secure funding isn't just unethical, it damages legitimate preservation efforts everywhere. By Thursday evening, everything was in place for our confrontation the following morning. I barely slept that night, reviewing our strategy and preparing mentally for whatever tactics Veronica might employ. Friday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through my bedroom window, as if nature itself approved of our plan for justice. I dressed carefully in my most professional attire, a dark gray suit I usually reserve for meeting important clients. This wasn't just about making an impression, it was about reclaiming dignity that Veronica had tried to strip away from an entire community. At precisely 10 o'clock, I walked into the notary's office, where Veronica was already waiting with Douglas and a representative from the suspicious foundation she'd been collaborating with. Their confident smiles suggested they believed they had won, that I had surrendered to their pressure tactics. Veronica extended her hand. "I'm pleased we could reach an amicable solution, Mr. Miller. I believe this arrangement will benefit everyone." I shook her hand firmly. "Indeed, I think today will resolve everything," I replied, maintaining a neutral expression that revealed nothing of what was about to unfold. As we seated ourselves around the conference table beneath the bright fluorescent lights, the door opened again. Melissa and Frank entered, followed by a serious-looking woman in a tailored suit who identified herself as Special Investigator Rebecca Torres from the county prosecutor's office. Veronica's smile faltered. "What is this? I thought we were here to finalize our agreement." Instead of responding directly, I carefully placed a different set of documents on the table. Not the capitulation agreement she expected, but the formal complaint alleging HOA fraud, forgery, and financial improprieties. "Miss Whitmore," Investigator Torres began, "I'm here to inform you that the county prosecutor's office has opened an investigation into multiple allegations of fraud, document forgery, and misappropriation of funds related to the Sunridge Valley Homeowners Association." The blood drained from Veronica's face as Torres continued reading the allegations. Douglas, immediately recognizing the severity of the situation, physically distanced himself from Veronica. "I've merely been acting on my client's instructions," he stammered. "I had no knowledge of any improper activities." In the defining moment of this confrontation, I produced my final evidence. A copy of the original HOA founding documents from 1992, containing signatures of the founding members and an overlooked special provision. Article 12, Section 3, I read aloud. "The association may be dissolved in cases of power abuse for personal gain through a single vote from any member still holding an original copy of these bylaws." The room fell silent as I revealed the truth. My father, James Miller, was one of the founding members who later moved away. He sold me this land through a trust to conceal our connection, and I am now in possession of the original bylaws. Veronica's confident facade crumbled completely as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. Years of manipulation and control were collapsing around her in real time. Douglas was already gathering his papers, clearly planning his professional exit strategy. The foundation representative looked horrified, realizing he had nearly become complicit in a fraudulent scheme. With a sense of calm resolution rather than vindictiveness, I officially exercised the power granted by that long-forgotten provision. I, as the son of a founding member and legal holder of the original bylaws, hereby vote to dissolve the Sunridge Valley Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Investigator Torres confirmed that her office would be conducting a full investigation into all financial activities of the now-dissolved HOA, particularly focusing on the preservation grant applications and personal enrichment schemes. Veronica, finally grasping that her kingdom had crumbled, alternated between threats and pleas. "You have no idea what you're doing," she hissed. "I have powerful friends." "This isn't over," I simply smiled. "Actually, Ms. Whitmore, it was over before it began. You just didn't know it." As Investigator Torres escorted Veronica out for further questioning under the bright midday sun, she turned back with a venomous glare. What she didn't realize was that I felt no hatred toward her, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice served. Yet despite this resolution, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't quite the final chapter of our story. News of the HOA's dissolution spread rapidly throughout Sunridge Valley, creating a wave of diverse reactions. Most residents celebrated their newfound freedom, while others worried about what would happen to community standards without oversight. Within days, handmade signs appeared on several lawns, "Free from HOA tyranny" and "Sunridge Valley Liberation Day." The atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Children's basketball hoops that had been banned suddenly reappeared in driveways. Houses began sporting fresh paint colors previously forbidden, and residents started greeting each other more freely, as if a collective weight had been lifted. "It's like everyone can breathe again," Frank commented as we walked through the neighborhood one morning. "I haven't seen people this happy here in years." The most significant immediate change was the removal of the fake historic train, which city workers began dismantling the week after our confrontation. Watching those rusty cars being loaded onto trucks brought a deep sense of satisfaction. The physical embodiment of the deception was finally being cleared away. To address concerns about the community's future, I organized a neighborhood meeting at the local park on a beautiful Saturday morning. Under the shade of large oak trees, nearly 100 residents gathered to discuss what would come next. "The dissolution of the HOA doesn't mean we can't still be a community," I explained to the assembled neighbors. "In fact, it gives us a chance to build something better, based on mutual respect rather than coercion." Frank proposed creating a voluntary neighborhood association, focused on community support rather than restrictive rules. We could organize block parties, coordinate neighborhood watch programs, and maintain common areas without dictating what color people can paint their mailboxes, he suggested, to widespread approval. Melissa and other former board members shared stories about how the HOA had gradually transformed from a community service organization into Veronica's personal power structure. It started with reasonable rules about property maintenance, but over time, every aspect of our lives became regulated, from what plants we could grow to when we could have visitors. Douglas, who had distanced himself from Veronica's legal troubles, surprisingly appeared at the meeting in the late afternoon sunshine. "I need to apologize," he told the gathered residents. "As legal counsel, I failed in my duty to ensure the HOA was operating properly. While I wasn't privy to all of Ms. Whitmore's schemes, I should have questioned many of the documents I was asked to process." His candor earned grudging respect from many present, and his insights into the HOA's financial operations provided valuable information for the ongoing investigation. He revealed that Veronica had been systematically manipulating records for years, creating a shadow financial system that diverted substantial funds to personal projects and associates. The so-called emergency funds that justified those special assessments last year, they went directly to a shell company controlled by her brother-in-law, Douglas explained, confirming suspicions many residents had harbored for years. As our community meeting was wrapping up, a luxury car pulled into the parking lot, and a distinguished man in an expensive suit approached our gathering. He introduced himself as Michael Reynolds, the executive director of the Heritage Cultural Foundation, the legitimate preservation organization that Veronica had been attempting to defraud. When we received evidence of the fraudulent application, we began our own investigation, he explained. What Ms. Whitmore was attempting was unfortunately not unique. We see similar schemes several times a year. Rather than being angry, Reynolds was impressed with our thorough research and community organizing. Instead of a fraudulent railway preservation project, we'd like to discuss funding a genuine community improvement initiative, he proposed. The foundation supports authentic neighborhood enhancement projects that honor local history while serving current residents. He suggested the possibility of transforming the former railway area into a linear park with walking trails and community spaces, a plan that would maintain my property access while creating a genuine asset for the neighborhood. Furthermore, Reynolds expressed interest in having me serve as a consulting architect for the project, valuing my design skills and commitment to community integrity. Frank later shared news that Veronica was facing multiple criminal charges, not just related to the HOA fraud but also for embezzlement from other local charitable organizations. She was arrested trying to leave the state on a bright morning last week, just as she was boarding a plane, he reported with a hint of satisfaction. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial misconduct stretching back years, affecting multiple communities and organizations. Several other former board members who had actively participated in her schemes were also under investigation, though many had been misled or intimidated rather than willing accomplices. The county prosecutor issued a statement encouraging other communities to review their HOA operations and ensure proper legal compliance, suggesting this case might be the tip of a much larger iceberg. Standing on my property in the golden late afternoon light, watching the old train being dismantled, I felt a strange sense of peace. The battle had not only secured my dream property for my personal architectural project, but had also connected me to a community, something I hadn't expected following my painful divorce. What had begun as a simple property dispute had evolved into something much more meaningful. The reclamation of a neighborhood from years of petty tyranny. My architectural plans had evolved too, now incorporating community-friendly elements that would help integrate my home with the surrounding neighborhood, rather than standing apart from it. This experience had reminded me why I became an architect in the first place, to create spaces that bring people together rather than divide them. Today, 1 year after the confrontation, my modern-designed home stands completed on that property, a creative, peaceful space just as I had dreamed. The former railway area, where the train once blocked access, has been transformed into a beautiful walking trail with trees and benches, where residents regularly stroll and chat in the early sunshine. As for Veronica, she's completing 200 hours of community service and serving 3 years of probation, working at a recycling facility, fitting for someone who tried to recycle an old train into an illegal blockade. There are days I still can't believe that a single signature from the original HOA bylaws my father had preserved could transform an entire community's life. But it reminds me that sometimes the greatest power doesn't rest with those who shout the loudest, but with those who take the time to read the fine print. And if you're dealing with an HOA that's making your life difficult, remember, check the original bylaws. Sometimes the answer has been there all along, just waiting for someone patient enough to find it.
Thanks for riding the emotional roller coaster with QA Stories. Buckle up, the next one's even twistier.